On the tarmac, she handed him one quiet envelope while another woman held his arm. He saw a surrender, not a warning. In rooms built for powerful men, how long can a sealed truth sit before it asks for its seat? Grant Wexler did not reach for the white envelope right away. He let it hang there between him and Marla, as if the few inches of air separating their hands belonged to him too. Behind him, the dark helicopter waited on the private tarmac, its blades still and sharp against the pale morning sky. 4 security men stood near the landing pad in black suits. A small group of donors waited farther back, speaking in low voices beside 2 polished cars. Marla Bennett held the envelope steady. She wore white because she always wore white to difficult meetings. Her father used to tease her about it, saying she dressed like a woman who expected the truth to show up clean, even when people did not. That morning, under the cold North Carolina sun, the white suit made her look almost too calm, Grant noticed. Of course he did. You didn't have to come all the way out here, he said, his voice smooth enough for the donors to hear, and gentle enough to sound kind. In a red dress that looked chosen for the cameras, though there were none, her hand rested lightly on Grant's arm. She looked at Marla with the careful smile of a woman who believed the hard part was already over. I wanted to deliver it myself, Marla said. Grant's eyes dropped to the envelope. Then I assume you've made the sensible choice. No one on the tarmac spoke. Even the donors had gone still. Marla could feel the weight of every stare. She knew what they saw. A 32-year-old woman, too young for the chair her father had left behind, too quiet to fight, too alone to keep a failing scholarship foundation from collapsing. They saw Grant in his tailored Navy suit, standing beside a new source of money and influence. They saw Celeste, bright and composed, already fitting into the future he had built without Marla. So Marla let them see what they wanted. She placed the envelope in Grant's hand. His fingers closed over it with a small, satisfied nod. He did not open it there. He did not need to. In his mind, the scene had already written itself. Marla had come to surrender. Marla had accepted that the foundation needed stronger hands. Marla had finally understood that grief and loyalty were not business plans. Celeste's smile softened into something almost polite. I'm sure this wasn't easy. Marla looked at her for 1 second longer than kindness required. No, she said. It wasn't. Grant slipped the envelope under his arm. The board will appreciate your cooperation. My cooperation, Marla repeated quietly. He gave her the smile he used in conference rooms, the one that made a threat sound like advice. You know what I mean, she did. That was the worst part. Only a few months earlier, Grant had spoken of the Bennett Community Scholarship Fund as if it were something sacred. He had sat beside her at donor dinners and told people her father had built more than a foundation. He had called it a second chance for working people. For men and women who had lost factory jobs, raised children, buried spouses, and still needed to learn a trade before life passed them by. Now he called it inefficient. Now he called her emotional. Now he was leaving for a donor retreat with Celeste Harrow at his side, carrying what everyone believed was Marla's agreement to step aside. The helicopter door opened. Grant turned toward it, then paused. Marla, he said, as if offering mercy. Don't make the meeting harder than it needs to be this afternoon. The fund can still survive, but not if you turn this into a personal matter. She looked past him, at the helicopter, at the donors, at the quiet line of security men. Everything around him had been arranged to make power look natural. I understand what's at stake, she said. Then she turned and walked back across the tarmac without raising her voice. By afternoon, the foundation office felt smaller than it had the week before. The building sat near the edge of town. Plain brick, no grand lobby, no shining sign. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The walls still held framed photos of former students in work shirts and graduation gowns, men and women smiling beside welding masks, tool belts, nursing certificates, and truck driving permits. Marla passed them on her way to the boardroom. Her father owned every face on those walls, not by donor category, not by report numbers. By name. In the boardroom, several members were already seated. They did not look cruel. That almost made it harder. They looked tired, worried, practical. They had spreadsheets in front of them and fear behind their eyes. Grant arrived late enough to be noticed, but not late enough to be rude. Celeste was not with him this time. The envelope was. He placed it beside his folder and began before anyone asked. We all care about what Mr. Bennett built, he said. No one is questioning that. But care is not enough to keep lights on. The fund needs a new structure, stronger donor confidence, and leadership that can make hard decisions without being tied to the past. One board member shifted in his chair. Another avoided Marla's eyes. Grant continued, calm and calm. Marla has served during a difficult transition, but temporary leadership was never meant to become permanent leadership. Marla sat with her hands folded over a narrow key ring in her lap, the metal edges pressed into her palm. They were the keys to the training rooms on the west side of the building, rooms that had not held a full class in months. Marla, one board member said gently, "We need to know whether you're willing to support a transfer of operational control." There it was. Not an attack. Not a demand. Something worse, a request like a decision already made. Grant leaned back, waiting for her to defend herself. Marla looked at the faces around the table. People who had once brought casseroles to her father's memorial. People who had promised they would protect his work. People who were now staring at Grant because he had money behind him and she only had a name. "I'm willing," she said slowly, "to review any proposal that protects the students." Grant's expression barely changed, but she saw the flicker in his jaw. "That's not what was asked," he said. "No," Marla answered. "It's what matters." Silence settled over the table. The meeting did not end in a vote. It ended in something quieter and more dangerous. Deferred language, private calls, a promise to reconvene. By the time the board members gathered their folders, Marla already knew where the room had shifted. Not toward truth. Safety. And Grant looked safe to them. When everyone had gone, Marla took the West Hall alone. The last training room was unlocked only because she had the old key. The door stuck at the bottom, swollen from years of damp weather. Inside, the desks were stacked against one wall. A row of welding helmets sat on a shelf, dull with dust. The old machines stood silent, their cords coiled like sleeping snakes. This was what the board had not seen from the tarmac. This was what Grant had never bothered to understand. Marla stepped inside and let the door close behind her. The room was cold. Empty chairs faced a whiteboard, still marked with half-erased measurements from the last class. Someone had left a pair of work gloves on the instructor's bench. They were stiff now, gray at the fingertips. She set the key ring on the desk and looked around at the place her father had once called the heart of the fund. Pain reached her face. Not enough to break her. Just enough to show her what was being taken. At the far end of the hall, a light clicked off. The building settled into evening silence. In the boardroom, Grant's proposal waited in a stack of folders. In the donors' minds, he was already the safer choice. Marla picked up the keys again, feeling their weight in her palm, and stared at the dark machines, as if one of them might tell her where to begin. By morning, the keys had left a shallow red mark across Marla's palm. She had carried them from the dark training room to her car, then from her car back into the foundation office. As if setting them down would mean admitting the doors they opened no longer mattered. When she stepped into the small boardroom, the keys were in her coat pocket, their dull weight knocking against her leg with every step. Grant was already there. He stood at the far end of the table with his folder open. His jack buttoned, his voice low and practiced. Celeste sat near the wall in a straight-backed chair, not at the table, but close enough to be seen. That was the point. She was not there to speak. She was there to remind everyone that money had chosen a side. "Marla," Grant said, turning as if the meeting had been waiting for her out of courtesy. "Thank you for coming in so early." She took the only empty chair. "I was asked to be here." A few board members looked down at their papers. No one corrected her. Grant placed one hand on the folder in front of him. "I'll keep this simple. My family's support, along with several pledged commitments, cannot continue under the current structure." The words landed softly. That made them worse. One of the board members leaned forward. "Grant, are you saying the funding is being withdrawn?" "I'm saying confidence has limits." Grant looked around the room before his eyes returned to Marla. This foundation was built with good intentions. No one disputes that. But good intentions do not keep programs alive. Marla kept her hands still in her lap, the keys pressed against her thigh through the fabric of her coat. She could hear her father's voice in that small pressure, not as memory, but as warning. Don't mistake a polite room for a fair one. Grant slid a packet toward the center of the table. The proposal before you would transfer operational control to a new advisory structure. It would protect the fund, reassure donors, and give us a path forward. A path forward, Marla said. He smiled faintly. Yes, and my role? His expression softened for the room. You would be honored, of course. Your father's legacy matters to all of us. But leadership requires a certain distance from grief. There it was again. Not cruel enough to object to. Not direct enough to call an insult. Just a clean little blade dressed up as concern. Celeste lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back at Grant. Her silence worked exactly as he intended. Beside him, she looked like the future, young, polished, connected, unburdened by shuttered classrooms and unpaid invoices. A board member cleared his throat. Marla, we have to consider the possibility that the fund may not survive without stronger donor confidence. Marla looked at the packet but did not touch it. And stronger donor confidence means giving control to the man who just withdrew support. Grant's smile did not move. It means accepting help before pride costs working people their last chance. That line shifted the room. She felt it. The board did too. He had taken her reason for fighting and turned it against her. Marla could have raised her voice. She could have told them Grant had his father's photograph as he would protect the work. And to Celeste, and asked when loyalty had become a donor strategy. But every angry word would only make Grant's argument easier. So she took a breath and stood. I won't vote on a packet I haven't reviewed, she said. And I won't call surrender a rescue just because it comes with a pledge. Grant's eyes sharpened. The boardroom went quiet. Marla picked up the packet, tucked it under her arm, and left before anyone could turn her dignity into debate. That afternoon, she drove west until the office buildings gave way to low hills, roadside churches, old gas stations, and empty workshops with faded signs. The town where the first welding class had opened looked smaller than she remembered. It had the worn-out patience of a place that had been asked to survive too many closures. The old training shop sat behind a gravel lot, its metal siding dulled by weather. Marla unlocked the side door with one of the keys from her pocket. It turned hard, then gave. Inside, the air smelled of dust, steel, and shut-in heat. 3 welding booths lined the wall. A workbench sagged under old clamps and helmets. In the corner, a machine sat under a tarp, bulky and quiet, as if waiting for someone to believe it still had a purpose. You planning to stare it back to life? The voice came from the open doorway. Nolan Pierce stood there in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hands scarred and heavy at his sides. He looked older than when she had last seen him, but not softer. Marla turned. I was hoping you still had a key. Your father never took mine back. He stepped inside and looked around, his face tightening only a little. Figured nobody on that board remembered this place existed. They remember it as a cost. That's because none of them ever watched a man get his first steady paycheck at 56. Marla swallowed once. I need to know if it can run again. Nolan looked at the machines, then at her white suit. Run? Maybe. Run clean? Not without work. You'd need parts. Venting checked. Insurance cleared. A real instructor, you. He gave a dry sound that was almost a laugh. I didn't say that. No, Marla said. But you haven't left. For the first time, Nolan looked directly at her. His face did not soften, but something in his eyes shifted. Why now? Because Dust was trying to take the foundation. Because the board was afraid. Because her father's name was being used as decoration while his work was being buried. All of that was true. But Marla said the thing that mattered. Because if this place still has value, I need to prove it in a way they can't dismiss as sentiment. Nolan nodded slowly toward an old filing cabinet near the office door. Then you don't start with the machine. You start with the people. He pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a thick folder, the paper edges yellowing. Across the front in her father's handwriting were 2 words, former students. Nolan laid it on the workbench. A truck door shut outside. A moment later, Deacon Miller stepped in, cap in hand, shoulders squared like a man prepared not to be pitied. His eyes moved from Nolan to Marla, then to the open folder. Nolan said you were reopening old wounds, Deacon said. Maybe old doors, Marla answered. He did not smile. People around here don't like being used for speeches. I'm not asking for speeches. What are you asking for? Marla looked at the folder. Names filled the first page. Some had notes beside them. Hired, certified, moved for work. Took night shift. One name had a company written beside it, then an arrow pointing to three more names, a small pattern. A living one. I'm asking whether this program did what my father said it did, she said. And whether anyone is willing to help me show that before it disappears. Deacon's jaw worked once. It did more than that. He reached for the folder, turned 2 pages, and stopped at a name halfway down. His thumb rested beside a handwritten note Marla had never seen before. It wasn't just a job placement. It referenced a training contract, then another. Both marked with initials she did not recognize. Nolan leaned over her shoulder. His face changed. Marla looked from the note to the packet Grant had handed her that morning. The names on the old list were not just former students. They were tied to work, to contracts, to promises the board had never discussed. And one of those promises had been moved. She did not know where yet. She did not know by whom. But the first thread had lifted. Marla closed the folder with care, as if it had become something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Nolan looked at the covered machine. If you're serious, we can get one booth running by tomorrow evening. Not all of it, one. Wasn't enough to start, Marla said. Deacon watched her for a long second, still guarded, still proud. Then he took off his coat and laid it across the workbench. Then, tell me what needs moving. By the next morning, the old welding shop had stopped feeling like a room full of dead equipment. It was not alive yet, not close. One booth had been cleared, 2 extension cords had been tested and rejected, and Nolan had made a list of parts in blocky handwriting that looked more like a warning than a plan. Deacon had called 3 former students before breakfast and left messages with 2 more. Marla had set up a folding table near the office door with the packet from Grant, the former student folder, and a yellow legal pad lined with names. The shop was still cold enough that she kept her coat on. Nolan stood over the old machine with a flashlight, squinting at a worn label. This one can run. If we don't ask it to be young again. Marla looked up from the folder. How much would it take? Money or patience? Both. Less money than the board thinks. More patience than Grant has. Deacon, sitting on an overturned bucket with his phone in hand, gave a short nod. Ray Collins called back. He said the plant outside town still needs certified welders. Not a promise, but he'll listen. Marla wrote it down. Name became 2. 2 became 5. Some former students had moved away. Some were working nights. Some had changed numbers and disappeared into the ordinary roughness of life. But enough of them were still within reach to make the room feel different. Not saved. Not yet, but not empty. Marla opened the old folder again and ran her finger down the handwritten notes. Hired, completed, referred, contract pending. That phrase appeared more than once. It was marked beside names, then crossed through in different ink. The more she looked, the less it felt like an old administrative habit. It felt like a trail. Nolan came to the table and tapped one line with his thumb. That one shouldn't be crossed out. You remember it? I remember your father arguing about it. He glanced toward the door, as if the past might walk in wearing work boots. He had a local shop ready to take 3 men if the foundation could cover the last certification fee. Then the paperwork got quiet. Quiet? How? Quiet like nobody wanted to answer the phone. Deacon stood and came closer. Same thing happened with the evening class. We had men ready. Women, too. Folks who couldn't quit day work. Then somebody said funding had been redirected. Marla looked from the folder to Grant's packet. The language in his proposal was careful. Transition, efficiency, donor confidence. He had made the foundation sound like a weak body in need of a stronger spine, but the names in front of her told another story. Her phone buzzed beside the legal pad. A message from a board member. Polite, brief, asking whether she intended to respond constructively. Before the next vote, Nolan read her face. That from him? No. Marla set the phone screen down. From someone trying not to choose sides. That means they are did, Deacon said. Marla did not answer. She turned the page again. Near the back of the folder, tucked behind a list of former students, was a photocopied contract summary. It had no full agreement attached. Just a project name, a training block, and a note in her father's writing. Evelyn has the backup. Marla stared at the line. Nolan noticed. Evelyn? Price? Marla nodded. She handled the books before the office went digital. She kept paper on everything, Nolan said. Didn't trust computers. Didn't trust men who smiled too much either. Deacon folded his arms. You think she still has it? I think my father thought she did. Nolan looked toward the cleared welding booth, then back at the folder. Then go ask her before somebody else remembers she exists. By late afternoon, Marla was sitting at a small kitchen table in a quiet house at the edge of town, while Evelyn Price held a mug of tea with both hands and refused to look directly at the folder. The kitchen was neat in the careful way of someone who lived alone and kept busy to avoid thinking too long. A stack of mail sat squared beside the salt shaker. A wall clock ticked louder than it needed to. "I don't know what Nolan told you," Evelyn said. "He told me you kept paper records." "I kept what I was supposed to keep." Marla rested her hands on the table. "My father wrote that you had backup for a training contract. I'm not here to accuse you of anything." Evelyn gave a small, bitter breath. That's usually what people say before they start. Marla did not push. She had learned in the boardroom that pressure could make truth retreat. So she waited. Evelyn looked older than Marla remembered, but her eyes were still sharp. There was fear in them, and something heavier than fear. Shame, maybe. Or the tiredness of carrying a thing too long. "I saw transfers I didn't like," Evelyn said at last. "Not illegal on the surface. That's what made them so easy to explain away. Vendor changes, administrative fees. Training partners I'd never heard of." Marla kept her voice low. "When? After your father got sick." Before he was ready to admit he couldn't watch every line himself, the words struck harder than Marla let show. Evelyn stood slowly and went to a narrow cabinet near the pantry. From the back, behind old cookbooks and a tin of sewing supplies, she pulled out a worn paper notebook held closed with a rubber band. She did not hand it over right away. "I should have brought it to him," Evelyn said. "I told myself I needed one more statement, one more month." Then he was gone, and Grant was already in every room, saying he only wanted to help. Marla looked at the notebook, then at Evelyn's hands. "What's in it?" "Dates, check numbers, contract names, where money was supposed to go and where it started landing instead." Evelyn's voice tightened, enough to show the pattern. Not enough, by itself, to save anything. That was the part Marla understood immediately. A scandal could burn through the foundation faster than Grant ever could. Donors would run. The board would panic. The people who needed the classes would be left standing outside another locked door. Evelyn finally placed the notebook on the table. Marla opened it with care. Page after page held neat columns, copied figures, arrows, and short notes in the margins. Some contract names matched the old student folder. Others matched language in Grant's packet. A few were circled twice. Near the bottom of one page, a company name had been underlined. Beside it, Evelyn had written, "Tied to Harrow Group." Marla went still. Evelyn saw her face. "I never proved that connection, but you suspected it. I suspected enough to stop sleeping well." That evening, Marla, Nolan, and Deacon stood in the Foundation's record room, under a single humming light, comparing Evelyn's notebook to the contract board they had spread across two file boxes. The old paper records smelled of dust and cardboard. Deacon had pinned student names to one side. Nolan had marked local employers on the other. Marla drew lines between them with a black marker. The pattern did not shout, it did something worse. It held together. Training contracts meant for local workers had been routed away, renamed, delayed, or replaced. The board had seen shortages. The students had seen closed doors. Grant had seen opportunity. Nolan removed his cap and rubbed one hand over his face. "This is bigger than the shop." Deacon looked at the names on the board. "Then we make it about the people, not just the money." Marla nodded. "Both. If we only show the money, they'll call it a dispute. If we only bring people, they'll call it sentimental." She looked at Evelyn's notebook lying open beside the contract board. "We need the figures," she said. "And we need every living result this fund ever produced." Deacon picked up his phone. "Then I'll make more calls." Nolan reached for the list of parts. "And I'll get that booth running." Marla stayed where she was, staring at the final page Evelyn had copied. The last comparison was cleaner than the others. A contract marked for the welding program had not vanished. It had been redirected under a new partner name, then folded into the same proposal Grant was calling a rescue. Evelyn stood in the doorway, pale but steady, holding one more folded sheet. "I kept this separate," she said, "because once you use it, there's no quiet way back." Marla took the sheet, but did not open it yet. For a moment the room seemed to shrink around the four of them. The old files, the names on the board, the notebook, the folded paper, and the weight of what would happen if the truth came out wrong. Then Marla opened it. Her face did not change, but her grip tightened. Now she understood. If she struck too soon, Grant might fall, but the foundation could fall with him. Marla did not carry Evelyn's final sheet into the boardroom first. She carried the student list. It lay inside a plain folder against her white suit, close to her ribs, while Evelyn's notebook and the contract comparisons stayed in a second folder beneath it. That order mattered to her. If she began with money, Grant would call it an accounting dispute. If she began with people, the board would have to remember what the fund had been created to do. The large meeting room was already full when she arrived. Grant stood near the head of the table, speaking quietly with two board members. He looked rested, prepared, certain. A voting packet sat at every seat, thick enough to feel final. Celeste stood just outside the inner circle of chairs, dressed as carefully as she had been at the airfield, though this time there was strain around her mouth. Grant saw Marla and smiled. "Marla," he said, "I'm glad you decided to come." She took her seat without answering. That small silence made him pause, but only for a second. He had built the morning to look inevitable. Donor letters, transition language, a clean proposal. The same kind of careful words he had used from the beginning. The chair called the meeting to order, and Grant rose first. He spoke about stability. He spoke about confidence. He spoke about preserving the fund before emotion and old attachments damaged it beyond repair. He did not raise his voice once. He did not have to. Every sentence had been polished until it sounded responsible. Then he reached for the packet in front of him. "The proposal before the board is not about blame," he said. "It is about saving what can still be saved." Marla looked at the folder under her hand. "Before the board votes," she said, "I'd like to enter a response." Grant's smile tightened. Of course. Several members shifted in their chairs. One looked relieved. Another looked afraid. Marla stood, but she did not open Evelyn's notebook. She opened the student list. "Nolan Pierce is here," she said. The door at the back of the room opened, and Nolan stepped in wearing a clean work shirt, his hands rough and visible at his sides. He did not look like a man comfortable in boardrooms. He looked like a man who had built things with tools no one at that table had ever held. Behind him came Deacon Miller, carrying a small stack of signed letters. Then came two local shop owners and several former students who stood quietly along the wall. No one made a speech. That was why the room changed. Marla placed the first page on the table. "These are students from the welding program," she said. "Not projections, not sentimental examples. People. Certifications completed, jobs taken, employers willing to hire again if the program reopens." Grant leaned forward. "No one disputes the program once had value." Deacon's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Marla turned the next page. "The program still has value. One booth is already being repaired. Nolan has confirmed the equipment can run with limited work. Deacon has reached former students. Local employers are willing to listen." "That doesn't answer the financial question," Grant said smoothly. "No," Marla said. "It leads to it." Evelyn rose from her chair near the end of the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the old paper notebook. For a moment, Marla saw the fear in her face. Not fear of Grant, exactly, but fear of what truth could break if it was handled badly. Marla gave her a small nod. Evelyn placed the notebook beside the voting packet. "I kept these records when the office began moving everything into new systems," she said. Her voice was thin at first, then steadier. "I should have brought them forward sooner." Grant's expression cooled. "Evelyn, I would be careful about implying things you can't support." She did not look at him. "I am being careful," she said. "That is why I copied every figure twice." Marla laid out the contract board next. Student names on one side, local employers on the other, training contracts in the middle. Then the redirected payments, the renamed partners, and the proposal Grant had brought that morning. The pattern did not need drama, it only needed to be seen. One board member removed his glasses. Another reached for the pages with both hands. The chair asked Evelyn a question, then another. Nolan answered when asked about the shop. Deacon spoke only when the board wanted to know whether former students would stand behind the program. "We're not here for charity," Deacon said. "We're here because that's Sesson or cult. We set because that place worked." The words settled harder than anger would have. Grant tried to regain the room. "This is exactly what I warned about. Emotion, confusion, old paperwork." Marla turned one final page. "This is the white envelope I delivered to you at the airfield," she said. Grant went still. She slid a copy across the table. "It was not a transfer agreement. It was my written objection to any private transfer of control without a full board review. You chose not to open it in front of the donors." The room was silent. Celeste looked at Grant then, not with triumph, not even with anger, with recognition. The kind that came late and hurt because it made earlier pride look foolish. "You told me she had agreed," Celeste said. Grant did not answer quickly enough. That was enough. In the hallway during the recess, Celeste stood apart from him. Her red dress no longer looked like victory. It looked like something she had worn before she understood the room she was entering. "My family's name is in those partner files," she said, low enough that only Marla and Grant could hear. Grant reached for control again. "Celeste, this is not the time." "No," she said, stepping back from his hand. "That's what you say when you need time to make something look better." When the board returned, the vote was brief. Grant's advisory authority was removed. The donor group tied to the redirected contracts was barred from any decision over operations until a full outside review was complete. The transfer proposal died without ceremony. Marla was formally recognized to continue leading the vote. Grant stood very still as the chair read the decision. No one shouted at him. No one needed to. He had lost the room he thought he owned. By late afternoon, the old welding shop was lit again. Not brightly, not perfectly. One booth had power. One workbench had been cleared. The machine still needed parts, and the floor still needed sweeping, but the room no longer felt abandoned. Nolan stood by the equipment with his arms folded. Deacon taped the first new sign-up sheet to the office door. Evelyn sat near the desk, the paper notebook closed in her lap, looking tired and lighter at the same time. Marla arrived last. The board had offered her the chair outright. She had accepted the responsibility, but not the old shape of it. Before leaving the meeting, she had asked for a new council to be formed. Students, instructors, local employers, and board members at the same table. No more saving working people without letting them speak. Nolan looked at her. "You sure about giving away that much say?" Marla looked at the lit booth, then at Deacon's sign-up sheet. "It was never supposed to be mine alone." For the first time all day, she touched the keys in her pocket and did not feel their weight as a burden. They were simply keys outside. The evening settled over the hills. Inside, the shop lights held steady. Marla stood just beyond the table where the new council would meet, not at the head of it, but close enough to open the door when the next person arrived.